Hi, I'm Nick Palmisciano.
And I'm Matt Finney.
And this is the Bad News Network. The UK is abuzz with anger right now over Boris Johnson taking the unusual step of making Parliament close. Now, for Americans, this whole thing ranges from why do I care to what does it all mean? I will try to fill in the gaps. Typically, Parliament is usually suspended prior to the Queen giving a speech or some other large state event. It's typically done at the request of the Prime Minister and never during a time of impending crisis. The last two suspensions occurred for periods of time of 4 and 13 days. This one, however, is different, as Johnson has stated that Brexit must occur by October 31st, and yet has suspended Parliament until 14 October. This will give the legislative body no more than 1 week to develop a Brexit plan or choose to oust Johnson entirely and stand up yet another government. Essentially, Johnson is banking on the fact that Parliament will not have the votes to oust him, thus allowing his dream of Brexit to come to fruition. Many Brits are hoping that that chicken is choked. For those of you that have no idea what this means, one example is that the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland would no longer be porous, and you would need a passport to travel between the two. Same with the UK and France. Tariffs between the EU and the UK would once again be in place. And if all of those changes aren't enough, the UK currently does not have the infrastructure or budget to deal with these changes. I have a proposal if this carriage of clowns does not come through. 51st, 52nd, and 53rd states. England, Ireland, Scotland. You all get to be your own state. The NHS stays as your own state healthcare, just like the fine Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You garner yourselves a fine military. You can travel freely back and forth to America proper. Give it a thought. Additionally, together, we can defeat Greenland. Never surrender!
The Hong Kong protests are into the 12th week with little progress. This week, 86 people were arrested in one day, including a 12-year-old. Police have used tear gas and rubber bullets, and one officer fired his firearm into the air. And while that's not harmless, it is the first time that a firearm has been introduced into the conflict. The media has covered both sides as it's unfolded. Originally, this all started as a protest to a now suspended extradition bill. This has since evolved into a demand for more freedoms and more democracies under the one country, two systems ideal. The protesters are against the restrictions of the Chinese government. They have even played and sung the American national anthem at a number of the protests. This irony has not been lost on meme lords making fun of American communist groups like Antifa. Still, the attention has been on the protesters and the police actions rather than the issues that started it all. China has refused to acknowledge the protests as anything more than just disruptive. It's amassed troops at the border in the event that they decide to quell the protests with overwhelming force. According to reports, more protests are still being planned, and there's no sign of China giving in to any demands or even listening in any way.
The G7 closed out this week in France. World leaders agreed upon $20 million in emergency funding to help Brazil deal with the forest fires. There was perceived progress on a resolution between Tehran and America, as President Trump stated he was open to discussions with Iran. Washington's escalating trade war with China was of great interest, with the other 6 members of the G7 stating, "Please stop." Questions arose as to whether or not Vladimir Putin should be added back to the G7. No consensus was reached on the topic, but leaders did say that they were not shelving the idea entirely, they were just putting it off for a little while.
A Southern California sheriff's deputy called in that he had been shot by sniper fire while exiting his station this week. Resources and personnel were deployed from multiple agencies in dramatic response to this call. The sheriff went and visited the deputy after he had been shot and transported to the hospital. Meanwhile, SWAT from various agencies cleared the adjacent apartment building. The problem with all this? It was all a lie. The deputy was making it up the whole time. The sheriff began to question the validity of the statement after he saw the deputy in the hospital who had been shot by a sniper but just had a little red mark on his shoulder. There was a hole in the deputy's body armor that he later admitted that he carved into with a knife. He has since been fired and an investigation has begun. No reasons have been given as to why the deputy decided to call in the hoax, so any speculation at this point is just a shot in the dark.
In a power move made by the weakest security force in the country, TSA has banned a water bottle that is shaped like a Star Wars thermal detonator. A TSA representative clarified that these items could reasonably be seen as an explosive device. To be fair, these soda bottles are fairly different from a normal soda bottle in that they won't fit in any cup holder ever made, and now I won't be able to bring it on an airplane either. The good news is that TSA misses 95% of the items that Homeland Security tries to smuggle in to test its efficacy, so you can probably just smuggle this soda bottle or an actual thermal detonator in anyway.
The wife, child, and mother-in-law of minor league baseball player Blake Bivens were found murdered at their home in Virginia. Police found the bodies of two of the women in the driveway, which prompted a 3-hour manhunt. Around noon of that day, a man was spotted running naked through the woods. That man, Matthew Bernard, is the brother of Bivens' wife. When police tried to subdue Bernard, he ran into a church parking lot, tried to choke a random bystander, and then was tased and maced by police. The police are receiving a lot of backlash for not using as much force as they could have in lieu of this man's crimes. There's currently no information as to why Bernard committed these crimes, whether he's just mentally unstable or if it's a vendetta of some sort. There's currently no information why Bernard committed these crimes, but it really doesn't matter because he murdered 3 people, including a kid. A hurricane named Dorian is moving away from a crash course with Puerto Rico, which is great news for the island that's still recovering from the last hurricane. Florida, however, is screwed. Dorian is on a direct path for Florida and is expected to make landfall as a Category 4 hurricane. Residents have been racing to stock up on storm essentials and have been boarding up windows in preparation for the hurricane. The Air Force has also begun preparations to deploy SAUT battlefield airmen to combat Hurricane Dorian.
The FBI is looking into why, in addition to all of the guards being asleep when Epstein was killing himself, that the 2 different cameras outside of his cell were also broken. Man, that's a real mystery.
Tulsi Gabbard slammed the DNC this week after not qualifying for the next round of Democratic debates. This occurred despite the fact that she reached the individual donor threshold necessary to participate. The DNC reportedly stated that Tulsi came up 2 polls short of the public support threshold. The DNC also refused to recognize a number of polls where Tulsi did in fact garner enough support. As Gabbard explained, this is why no one has any trust in the DNC. It just looks like another rigged-up election like the last one where they ousted Bernie to support Hillary. Speculation is that the DNC is mad at Tulsi for eviscerating Kamala Harris on the last debate. For those of you who missed the debate, we cut now to footage of Tulsi versus Kamala in that debate.
General Mattis wrote an op-ed this week basically calling out the president for pushing us away from our allies and for making a series of policy decisions that hurt us both domestically and abroad. But then he weirdly walked it back and said that he owes the president silence and then ominously added, but he won't hold it back forever. I've got to be honest, sir, that statement kind of rings of cowardice. If you think the public needs to know something about the president, then the time to say it is now, before the election. There's a huge percentage of the population that trusts you and puts immense weight into what you have to say. So if there's something that we need to know, we need you to say it. And if you simply don't like him, then it's really inappropriate to pretend there's something ominous floating out there on the horizon that we just don't know. And if you're holding it back just to make sure that the Pentagon doesn't block your book or so that you get greater book sales, that's entirely inappropriate. And finally, in Florida Man news, 74-year-old Gary Van Wisnik was arrested for castrating a man and keeping his testicles by his bedside table. According to Gary, he and the other man were on a date. They met on a dark website for men who have a fetish for castration. which to me is a little weird, because that's not a thing that men have fetishes about. He spruced up a room to make it look like a doctor's office, and then went about the business of removing the man's family jewels. Police got involved when an ambulance had to be called because Gary and the man were unable to stop the bleeding. You know why? Because neither of them was a doctor! In an interview with police, Gary stated that he had done this once before on another man in a motel room, where once again he was unable to stop the bleeding. He also removed one of his own testicles, where he once again was unable to stop the bleeding. Gary has been charged with practicing medicine without a license. Gary admitted that the whole thing was pretty nuts, but also added it took a lot of ball to go through with it. And with that, I'm Nick Palmisano.
And I'm Matt Finney.
And this is the Bad News Network. Our news is at least as bad as the news you're getting already, and if you want even more of us, then check out our new show on YouTube and Facebook called Leather Talk.